So to get us started, I'd love to ask you both to tell us about your experience, your recent experience with board metrics. Perhaps Lauren, you might start for us.
Sure, thanks, David. Yeah, so my experience with board metrics is a couple of things. So before I started OPEXEngine, I was an officer of a company here in the Boston area called Art Technology Group, ATG, which went public and then was later acquired by Oracle. So at that point, we were in, from 4 million to 160 million, we were in incredibly fast growth. We went public at, around 50 million and then did 160 million. So it was all about revenue growth, market access, or market leadership. And being the difference between being a public company and a private company was super interesting as well. And then with OPEXEngine, we work with hundreds and hundreds of software and SaaS companies with their finance organizations and with CFOs. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting, and maybe we can talk about it later, is the difference when you're acquired by another company, and particularly a big company, company in a different business, an adjacent business, how that changes the story, how that changes the metrics. And it's usually a very abrupt change. And so I can give my example. I ran OPEXEngine as an independent private company for 15 years, from founding through now. OPEXEngine, I'm still the CEO of OPEXEngine, but OPEXEngine's now owned by Bain & Company, one of the world's largest consulting firms. So I now have a board, in effect, of a few individuals from Bain who act as sort of the board. And now I'm reporting to people who aren't necessarily running, SaaS companies. They're used to running professional services. So we're in the process of figuring out what the right metrics are. But, in the initial phase, I have to get used to the fact that their interests are sort of different than my interest of running a SaaS company. They haven't asked me for utilization rates, which is a nice thing, because that's a typical professional services question. But
Sure.
It's much more about expenses, profitability, governance, those kind of things. And SaaS companies are usually all about growth. And I think that's something that we'll talk about here, but it's sort of my launch point for this conversation.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Such a shift. A lot of times we think of, new analytics tool, maybe an acquisition, and that changes things, or new systems, other changes in the business that impact reporting. But a new owner, certainly with different needs. How about for you, Kate?
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. So we actually met David when I was in a Salesforce admin class. I think it was in 2007 that we first met, which is when I actually left the sports world and came into the tech world. So my experience has been working with people like Lauren to actually build the slides. And I came up through being an analyst. I was working at Brightcove in 2007, and which is a SaaS online video platform company. We were a startup back then. I think I was the 86 hire, so true, startup life there, and grew through when we IPO'd in 2012. So, there was many iterations of that company and the way that we reported out on our metrics and the way we looked at things. And then I left and I went to a startup out in Framingham called Applause. And again, there was no sales operations RevOps at that point. So we kind of changed the way. That's when you put in process and you put in metrics, is when, I kind of show up, that's what happens. And then I actually went back to Brightcove in a much different place where we had been public for years, and we had C-levels that were coming from these really large companies where I've only had startup experience. So seeing how they managed board slides, and the board was completely different than something I've ever seen. And just how involved the board was in, joining our SCO, our sales kickoff. And you'd see them around the office a lot more than in my past companies. So that experience was completely different. And the way that we interacted with them and how I interacted, because I was joining at a much higher position than, being an analyst. And now I've been at Onapsis for 2 months now, haven't been a part of a board meeting yet or had to build slides, but I'm looking forward to contributing to this conversation with, being on the tactical side and the person who's actually crunching the numbers and putting together the deck, and then moving into a position where working with the C-levels on what that story is that we want to tell and how we do that. So
this is great. We can have a follow-up session with you as you assemble now for Onapsis. But how interesting doing it for both private and public. That is a topic I feel we'll come back to.